Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I am so excited today. I'm here with William Magnuson, who is the author of For Profit, A History of Corporations. William is a professor at Texas A&M Law School. He used to teach law at Harvard University. William, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Will. I'm excited to be here today.
So, your book covers 8 different corporations throughout history to illustrate kind of different facets of corporations. And I'll just read off the list, and then I'd love you to just give us a thumbnail sketch to orient listeners who haven't yet read the book. So you start with the you start with the Societates Publicanorum, the kind of tax farming corporations in Roman Republic. You go on to the Medici Bank, talk about the East India Company, the Union Pacific Railroad, in the chapter titled The Monopoly. You have a chapter, The Assembly Line, on Ford, the multinational, Exxon, the Raider, KKR, and the startup, Facebook. I'd love to hear you just maybe tell us why you chose these and what companies were on your short list that didn't make it in the book. I'm quite curious to hear which ones you were kind of on your long list of 20 companies that didn't get in the final 8.
Well, thank you, Will. That's a great question, and it's something that I thought quite a bit about. The book started out. I had worked prior to joining Texas A&M Law School, where I teach corporate law and contracts and M&A. I had worked as a M&A attorney in New York for a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, and I remember working there. I oftentimes thought, we've got these massive corporations that are defining our lives in all these really important ways. And in a way, actually, the corporations have become more important today than they've ever been to the life of the average human being. But there wasn't a good book explaining why we have corporations in the first place. And I don't mean by their corporate purpose. Every corporation is founded for a different purpose. Their founders have different ideas. But I was curious about going back to the origins of corporations. That is, when societies themselves first created these corporations. Why did they come up with the legal idea of a company? And so to do that, I wanted to go back and look at some of these foundational moments in the history of corporate law. So go back to ancient Rome, and there were these entities that you mentioned earlier, very good pronunciation of Societates Publicanorum, these tax gathering entities that were formed in ancient Rome. And then I will go through history about how they keep popping up. And what's fascinating about studying corporations over the span of 2,000 years is that you see trends, right? That you see some similarities pop up over and over again. Even when new civilizations recreate this idea, many of the features of the corporation have stayed the same. Things like limited liability, stock ownership, professional management classes. And so there's these reasons why these features keep popping up. I chose the 8 that I did because they were, right, anybody who hears these words, everybody's heard of all of these companies, right? The Medici Bank is one of the world's most famous, or history's most famous bank. The East India Company is maybe history's most famous corporation. They had an outstanding influence on the society around them. And so I wanted to go back and look at why they were created in the first place, why the entity, whether it was Queen Elizabeth or the Signoria of Renaissance Florence, why the governments created them. There were some companies that I thought about including and ended up not going with. Some of the ones that I was particularly interested in were, I thought that one that I actually did quite a bit of research on was, so I have these 8 major corporations. One that I didn't include, but I thought seriously about including and may do in the future, was actually a non-corporation, that is the Soviet Union. Right? Part of the idea behind the book was let's explore why we have corporations, but in a way, a more important question is, well, what would the world look like if we didn't have them? So the Soviet Union was one of the world's great experiments in trying to structure an economy in a way that doesn't include corporations, and it was not very successful.
So I was interested that there was no kind of consumer packaged goods company really on the list, no retail company exactly. Were there sort of a few other companies that you got close to thinking about other than these 8 that for some reason you had to narrow it down and you did not include?
Yeah, there certainly were some, right? So Walmart comes to mind as one that I did some research on, didn't wasn't included. On the tech companies, the last chapter on the startup was focused on Facebook, but there are many other major tech companies that right influence our lives in lots of ways. Apple, Google, Microsoft, all those would have been fascinating books, and I have thought about doing a book on separate book on those in the future. I've also thought about sort of other cultures corporations, right? So it would have been really fascinating. I did a good amount of research on Japanese corporations. There's a long history within the corporate law scholarship of studying Japanese corporate law because it has many similarities with U.S. law, but also some major differences. And so I looked into several of the Japanese corporations, ended up not adding those in there, but it would certainly be a fruitful area of research in the future.
Okay, well, that would be a longer book. That was actually my next question, which was to ask you about what other ancient cultures came up with, maybe independently generated this idea of a corporation. Did the Aztecs, the Incas, the Chinese have corporations? You mentioned Japan. Tell us a little bit about
Yep.
how that idea may or may not have originated in other cultures.
Sure. Yeah. So every culture it originates in a different way. In Europe, it was largely based on copied in a way the Roman model that was founded in ancient Rome when the Romans were thinking about ways to govern an empire that was expanding very quickly but didn't have a large governmental apparatus. And so the Romans said, well, one way to do that would be to outsource basically government services, things like tax gathering, building coliseums, laying roads, right? All these things that we think of today as basic government services, we're going to outsource them to private individuals or organizations. And so that was proved to be a very successful model. It was copied in a way in Renaissance Italy, and then moved up to the joint stock era of sort of the 1600s, and that was more or less the model that we still have today, with obviously some major changes. Other cultures have done it differently, right? So Japan has a long history of very strong, they refer to as zaibatsu, these sort of large sort of conglomerate organizations that have a lot of similarities. One thing that is different is that they typically are more family oriented. And so that has distinguished them, and there's less ability for outsiders to come in and take control over them. And so there's a large literature on how that has changed the sort of the path and the structure of the Japanese economy versus that U.S. one. So they're fascinating stories about how they've evolved in different cultures. The American corporation is largely based on sort of the European tradition.
Hmm. What about any other ancient cultures? I mean, the Aztecs, I think, I don't know, Mexico City or what used to be, Tenochtitlan had something like 1 million people or more. A lot of, complicated things to coordinate. Did they have any sort of corporate concept that we know of?
I did not look. I did not look extensively into Aztec corporations, but they might have.
Hmm. We zipped right by it, but let's just take a step back a little bit. Tell us what was the kind of originating driver, and across cultures, what has been that driver that leads to the creation of the corporate concept, and give us a bit of a definition. What are those common characteristics? You listed them quickly earlier, but let's spend a bit more time on that and expand.
Sure. Yeah. So some of the core traits of what I think of as the sort of the modern corporation are you have limited liability, that it's stockholders who own shares in a company, and the corporation cannot be sued individually for their any debts of the company, right? If Facebook goes out there and gets sued for violating privacy, the owner of a share of Facebook does not face liability, right? They can't go out and get their home in a lawsuit. So limited liability is one of the key features. Another one is professional management class, right? So there's a separation of the ownership, that is the owners of the shares of a company, and the managers, the people who are actually doing the day-to-day work. Um, there's also another important feature, which is that they are a single entity and they can operate on their own. That is, you don't need to get right every stockholder to come sign a contract anytime Facebook wants to buy a share or launch a new business, right? You don't need separate individuals to come together. They can operate on their own. That means they can sue, they can be sued, they can enter into contracts, right? They're a single entity. And that, in a way, that's actually the root of the word corporation. It's corpus. It means it's incorporated. You're bringing many different bodies into a single body. And then the final attribute, which I think is very important, is that they are, in a sense, immortal. Right? A corporation never dies, or it doesn't have to die. There is no end date at which a corporation ceases to exist. And that's an important feature of them because historically, if we go back to the ancient Roman Republic, the alternative was a partnership. Right? And so a partnership at the time, and actually still today, as a default, ends when any one of the partners dies. And that becomes a little problematic when the entity that you're talking about, Societates Publicanorum in ancient Rome, is doing a really important thing like tax gathering, right? Imagine if every time a single individual dies, you have to completely restructure the tax gathering structure of the ancient Roman Republic. That was a major problem. And so the immortality of the corporation, the idea that this thing keeps going, this body, this entity, this legal entity continues to exist even after the death of a single member or stockholder, is an important feature and allows corporations to be as efficient as they are. So those are the core features. And I think you also asked about why societies decided to create them. There's this story from the Roman Republic that I think is enlightening on this. And the basic structure of the story is that it was during the 218 BC. This is in the middle of the Punic War between Rome and Carthage. And at the time in 218, Hannibal had crossed over the Alps, right, with his army of infantry and cavalry and elephants, and he was sort of rampaging through the Roman countryside. And it was sort of looking like Rome was going to lose the war. They ended up turning it around through a strategy that is now known as the Fabian strategy. Basically, they started avoiding the set battles that they had lost to Hannibal, instead kept him in the field for longer. But there's another important point, which is actually they started to use private enterprise. So there's this really interesting story from Livy that Livy tells in his History of Rome, where he talks about how the Roman commander Scipio Publius Cornelius Scipio, writes to the Senate and says, I'm out of troops, I'm out of supplies, I'm not going to be able to win my battles anymore unless you supply me with new arms and weapons and equipment. But the Roman Senate is out of money. It's run out of money. And so the question is, how do they continue this war? How do they keep the war going when they don't have any money left? They can't get supplies they can't pay for supplies out of their own treasury. In a way, actually, it has a lot of relevance to today's world, right? About trying to make sure that we keep our allies supplied. And so what did the Roman treasury do? Well, what they said was they made a plea to the people of Rome. They said, if citizens will supply Scipio with clothes, grain, equipment, weapons out of their own pockets, then they will be repaid eventually from the Roman treasury when it's replenished. And in response, Livy says that 3 companies, or societates in the original Latin, of 19 members came forward and agreed to supply the necessary provisions. And the only thing they asked for in return was that they be exempted from military duty, and that if they lost their cargoes at sea, either from storms or from enemy action, that the state would make them whole. The Senate agrees to the terms, the companies follow through, and eventually the tides are turned and Rome goes to the offensive and they win. And so I think this gives you a little bit of a sense of why we as a society first decided to create the corporation, right? There's this governmental need, right? We're trying to win a war, but we don't have the necessary resources. Instead, we think the resources, or a lot of the resources, a lot of the efficiencies, are actually found within private individuals, private enterprises. And so we're going to give those private enterprises some special rights, some special legal rights. And in return, we hope that they will contribute to the Commonwealth, that will contribute to the common good. And so I think you see a similar pattern followed throughout history, wherever corporations pop up, right? There's this basic societal compromise. We're going to give special legal rights to these legal entities, because we think they're going to contribute to the well-being of our societies.
What sort of institutions had to be in place in the Roman Republic to allow these corporations to exist? So beyond just the Senate passing, law, okay, we can now have corp societatis. Talk to me about, were there corporate attorneys back in ancient Rome, and were there, banks, or what other kind of aspects of infrastructure had to be in place to allow them to function?
Yeah, so that's an important research question that has been talked about in the literature, and I think there were a couple of things that were really important that allowed these entities to thrive. One was a tradition of lawyering, as you mentioned. I don't know if I would exactly call them corporate lawyers, but this idea that there was the rule of law, right? The Senate is going to give these contracts to these enterprises, but if the contracts aren't in any way enforceable, or if they can't go out and actually get them enforced in a court of law, or force the Senate to live up to them, or if the Senate can't get the companies to live up to their terms, right, then that's going to be a problem. And so you do need the basic structure of the rule of law for corporations to thrive. And that, in a way, actually is one of the real mysteries of what happened in Renaissance Florence, which is an era, right? So the Renaissance Florence was an era when Europe was really divided into all these fragmented polises, right? You've got duchies and barons and kingdoms and empires and city-states, and they're all sort of fighting with each other. And so there wasn't really the rule of law in the sense that we think of it today within that European ecosystem. And so how did the Medici Bank overcome the lack of the rule of law? Well, within the city of Florence, there was a certain amount of law that was recognized by the Signoria, the governing authorities of Florence, but also they managed to create these really fascinating, complicated structures for ensuring that their own businesses would be protected when they operated elsewhere. So they created what is really the precedent for the modern bank holding company, right? They created all of these separate entities all around the continent, and they had 13, 14, 15 different branches, and each one was its own entity. And so it allowed them to sort of create a rule of law in a world that didn't have it. So that was, I think, an important part of the rise of the corporation was the rise of the rule of law.
I kept wondering about, reading chapters 1 and 2 of the book about what about religious bodies like monasteries? Were they in some way incorporated so they had the monastery could make agreements or sue people or be sued or have an immortal life, or talk to me about any kind of religious institutions that might have had corporate-like characteristics.
Yes, that's right. So, in fact, many of the history's first corporations were religious organizations. They not only were, many of them were there were some in England, there were some in Italy, and I didn't really focus on them because they weren't in the same sort of line of business, right? I was focused on for-profit, right? These profit-organized enterprises that we think of as the corporation today. But at the time, right, when in the Renaissance and even before then, some of the attributes of the corporation were actually given to religious organizations, to universities, sometimes to cities, right? And those are, right, nowadays we don't really think of them as a corporation. So I sort of set those aside as a special type of corporation that has more or less died away, although now we have 501c3 organizations.
And just say a little bit about cities. So cities would also be a corporation in some cases?
Yeah, so a lot of that was actually one of the. So I've been working on my new research project is a sort of a history of law, right? So one of the chapters is on the Magna Carta, and that was actually one of the big areas of dispute between King John and the barons, was that these cities, a lot of the cities actually wanted to make sure that they had their liberties and rights protected, and so they had a major complaint against King John because King John kept overruling their rights and overruling their privileges and saying, no, we're going to tax you as much as we like because there is no rule of law in England at the time. And so cities did benefit eventually from incorporation. And so they were another one of the sort of, I would say, the outliers of the history of the corporation, right? They're not really the world of for-profit enterprises that I focused on in the book, but they do have this really sort of interesting side history about how corporations are a very flexible entity that can be used for all sorts of other enterprises.
I'd like to hear your think about how some of these elements, like you laid out the four elements of a corporation, how some of those may have evolved over time, and maybe in some cases there were experiments that they had to iterate to get to the current state. Like limited liability, maybe start with that. How did did the first corporations have limited liability? Did it take a while to innovate and figure out that was a requirement? Talk us about some of the false starts and how that came about.
Yeah, limited liability is a fascinating element of corporations because it is in a way central, maybe even the central concept of the corporation, is the idea that you don't have to, that you cannot go after the owners of a corporation. If the corporation hurts you, harms you, injures you, and you sue them, you can't get the personal assets of the owners. And that provides some risk protection for any owner of a corporation. It allows those corporations to gather capital. With additional capital, they can launch bigger enterprises. And so it has this really magnifying effect of the power of the corporation in the world, the idea of limited liability. But it was not always so clear what exactly it would mean. And even today, actually, some of the statutes are somewhat ambiguous, and it requires you to know the case law in order to understand what limited liability really means in any given instance. But there's this fascinating story from the East India Company, which was one of the companies that sort of pioneered the idea of limited liability. And so one of the things that they learned was the East India Company formed in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth, and the idea was to trade with the East Indies. These were large ships that would sail halfway around the world and then back again and trade for spices. And so these were very risky enterprises, right? 1600, ships would founder, the sailors would get sick. And so they needed a lot of capital to rig out the ships, and then it would take a really long time to get it back. So very risky. And so the idea was, how do we structure our stocks to make sure that we can raise enough capital to send off these hopefully profitable voyages, but also make sure that the owners themselves, the people who buy the stocks, are interested in buying them, that they have a reasonable return. So at the beginning, they didn't know what to do. So the first thing they did actually was they had a system of separate voyages. So you wouldn't actually buy stock in the East India Company. You would buy stock in the first voyage of the East India Company, or the second voyage of the East India Company, or the third voyage. And so every year or so, they would launch a new voyage of ships. They would go out, they would trade, they would come back. So a year or so after you first buy your stock, the ships are back, and you know what your returns are. So that the advantage of that, of course, is that it means that that within 12, 13, 14 months, you're going to get your money back if the voyage is profitable and successful. So it limits some of the risk. But one of the things that they didn't understand was that this structure was creating all sorts of conflicts of interest within the company itself. So it turned out that when you sold your shares based on single voyages, so instead of buying shares in the East India Company, you would buy shares on the first voyage or the second voyage. Well, then all of a sudden, there's a conflict of interest between the first voyage sailors and the second voyage sailors, right? The first voyage sailors, who would get some stock in the company, in that voyage, they would really want to earn a profit on their voyage, but they didn't really care what would happen to the other voyage. And in fact, they might actually want to affirmatively mislead the other voyages if the other voyages might take some of their own profits. There were these cases of them basically mutinying against the other voyages so that they could get all the shares of the profits. So the East India Company says...
That was a story in your book that I just thought was hilarious. Well, not hilarious, but it was kind of quite memorable, of how they arrive to one port, and then one of their other East India boats is already there, and they kind of get attacked. Right?
Exactly, they get attacked by their own company,
shipmates.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild story, and that was fun. Part of the fun of researching it was going back, and you can read the journals. Right, this was the era of seafaring voyages and journals. That's what Jonathan Swift based Gulliver's Travels on, right? You can go back and you can read the journals of all these sailors, many of whom were working for the East India Company, and they're just fascinating stories of adventure and enterprise and these weird combinations of how to create a company in a time when the company doesn't really, we haven't worked down all the concepts yet.
Talk to me a bit about, one of the four that you listed, it was not governance. So, and you did, the owners are separated from the professional managers. So, talk to me a bit about kind of early ideas around governance and how that's evolved.
Yeah. So this idea that in the corporation there is a separation of owners and managers. Right? It's a um, important feature of the corporation, right? We wouldn't want, or it would be very difficult, right, for the modern corporation that has hundreds of thousands of shareholders to allow all of the hundreds of thousands of shareholders to have a say in every decision that the corporation makes. So you need managers. But again, this creates a conflict. Right? It turns out that maybe the managers will have an interest in promoting their own salaries rather than protecting the interests of the shareholders. And so one of the big questions that has percolated throughout history has been, how do we align the interests of the managers and the owners over time? And again, different structures have been used. One interesting wrinkle of it was Ford. The Ford Motor Company was founded by Henry Ford, early 1900s. And Ford actually didn't really like the idea of shareholders. Throughout the early years of Ford, he was constantly feuding with them. And the basic problem was he was the manager, right? He knew cars. He loved to fiddle around. He was this great tinkerer. He really knew cars. But what he wanted to make was the perfect car. Right? So he kept fiddling around. And he would raise money from wealthy investors to do that. But the wealthy investors wanted a return on it. And so there were these just sort of hilarious stories about him fighting with his own the shareholders, and they would keep saying, "Okay, where's your model?" And he says, "Okay, I've got this model, but it's not quite ready yet. I'll be ready in 6 months." And they're patiently wait, and then 6 months later, he comes back and says, "Well, just the tire's not quite right. I'll fix it in 6 months." And so they keeps delaying. And there's a famous case that I teach in my corporate law class called Dodge v. Ford, where he has this massive blow up between himself and his shareholders. Court ultimately holds, right, you actually have a duty to promote the interests of the shareholders. And so that's one of the foundational concepts in corporate law now, this fiduciary duty to protect the interest that managers have to promote the interests of shareholders. So you see these things slowly work out through experience. Right? You learn, oh, there's this conflict of interest between the managers and the owners. Well, how do we resolve that? Eventually, a court has to decide it.
Talk to me a bit about how shares have traded hands over history. In ancient Rome, did they have slips of paper that were stock certificates, or was it, written on a tablet in stone somewhere? Like, how did they actually, have a functioning stock market?
Yeah, there isn't a lot of evidence on exactly the structure or whether there were written documents or not. There certainly were written documents with respect to the actual structure of the societates themselves, and there's some debate in the literature about about how much these stocks were traded. Right, some think there actually was really a sort of a form of a stock market that would take place in the forum where people would buy the shares of companies. And there are these lines from Cicero and other people that say, actually, these are widely held. Shares of ownership in these companies and these corporations are widely held in ancient Rome. So there's pretty strong evidence that they were being traded, but it's unclear exactly the form it took. And it's obviously nowadays it's starting to shift, right? For a long time, there actually were just physical certificates that would represent what your stock ownership was. Now we've moved on to an electronic system. It's still mind-bogglingly complex about where shares are held. I teach an entire class about the way that you settle trades, and that's actually, interestingly enough, one of the big focuses nowadays in sort of fintech. And one of my other research interests is how to make our stock trading system more efficient, because it is still so Byzantine, this process of trading shares.
In your course of learning about or studying the professional managers in these corporations. I've always been curious as a management consultant. What can you tell us, if anything, of the deep history of business advisors, people who are not necessarily full-time professional managers, but either accountant type people or bookkeepers or attorneys or someone familiar with corporate law or someone who's a business expert? Is there any deep history of that, of corporations using professionals outside their four walls to advise them?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating question. I mean, that there obviously has always been that ecosystem of professional advisors, lawyers, accountants, consultants, who surround these corporations and help advise them and help them operate in the world. One of the interesting ones is KKR. So I have a chapter on KKR, the private equity firm, and obviously there a lot of the structures that they use and that they create in the first place. These are really complicated legal structures, right? And so they have to use law firms to help devise them, to make sure that they're complying with the law and also taking advantage of all the potential tax incentives. And so that has created an entire ecosystem, right, of private equity attorneys, right? Law firms have large departments devoted solely to that. There's also management consultants who focus on that as well. And I think that the role of sort of the outside consultants, whether it's law firm partner or management consultant or accountant, that has become more and more important as corporate law or just the corporate form has become more complicated in the modern world. Nowadays, we have large ecosystems around all those different elements that are not within the corporation, but allow the corporation to do things that it wouldn't be able to do if it didn't have those assistants.
Now, I've heard that some of the origin, some aspects of the venture capital industry trace back to the whaling ships of the United States, but perhaps it goes even further back. You talked about the East India Company, and individual voyages would have investors. Talk to me a little bit about what you learned around the history of investors other than individuals. So have there been kind of institutional investors dating way back?
Yeah, I mean, you do see them pop up over and over again, right? Oftentimes, the early financiers of a corporation are some type of large organization or a wealthy individual who spearhead it, and they're looking for profit. They're looking for a return on their investment. One of the chapters that focuses particularly on this is the startup chapter, the last chapter on Facebook. And one of the interesting things about the structure and the story of Facebook is how the way that it funded itself shaped its path in the future, right? The fact that it was being funded largely through venture capital meant that it was responding to the interests of venture capitalists, right? And oftentimes that model has now been honed into this idea that what we were going to create, we're going to take a bunch of bets, hoping that we get home run eventually, and we're going to try to reach rapid growth so that we can create a kind of platform effect, right? So everybody goes onto this network. Once everybody's on the network, then everybody else wants to be on the network. And so that really was the model that venture capital spearheaded and that leads to Facebook, and that then is emulated by so many other startups today. And it was, again, it shows just how much of a difference it makes where you're getting your money from, right? Who is funding this company, and the person, the identity, the interests, the characters, the psychology, the sociology of the people who are financing the corporation are almost as important as the people who are actually managing it.
As you mentioned, you teach corporate law, and so you studied it obviously, and you practiced it. As you researched this book, what did you discover that surprised you, that had not been part of your formal legal training, about the corporate form and its history?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of things surprised me. Some of the things. So one, when I first started writing the book, I actually didn't have a thesis, right? I didn't start with a thesis about what made corporations tick about why societies created them. And so it was actually, for me, quite surprising, showing just how consistent this both the structure of the corporation has been through time, and also the reason why societies, the way people talk about why they created these entities, right? There's this big debate today about what the corporate purpose is, whether they can think about the environment or social causes or governance issues, or whether they should just focus on profit. And all those debates have happened, right, forever, right? Almost for as long as the corporation has existed, those debates have been happening, right? Even Livy, or we just go back to the ancient Roman Republic, talk about the Societates Publicanorum, who helped fund the Roman Republic, allowed them to keep their wars going, allowed them to gather taxes. Livy also tells a story about some Societates who actually commit fraud, who end up loading up their ships and then sinking them, and they don't have any wares within them, but then they claim to the Roman government, they say, hey, I've got limited liability, you have to make me whole. And so they end up being accused of fraud. And so these big debates about the role of the corporation in society have always been playing out. There's even elements, right, of the too big to fail model that have popped up over and over again through history. So I guess one of the things is just how consistent, right, these big questions have been, and how insistent they've been, right? That societies keep asking themselves these problems, that we've never really solved them. So I guess some of what surprised me about the consistency is just how similar the structures have been, just how similar the debates within society have been. And there's also an interesting question, right, about how things have changed. For me, one of the most surprising things is just how right, the major corporations in history have always led to some major change in the way that they've been regulated. Right, they've always, some new issue has popped up when there's mass production, or when there's oil production, or when there's worries about too big to fail. But more and more, I find that actually we are not leading to changes in law. Right? The worries that we have about corporations today are not leading to major changes in the way that we regulate them. And so that has surprised me. Right? There was this trend of lots of reform historically, and then less reform lately. And that in a way is a cause for concern, right? That maybe the structures by which we go about regulating corporations are starting to fail us.
Like, what would be the last big shifts in how we regulate corporations? You're thinking Sherman
So I mean,
antitrust,
to be
or
honest, really, probably the last big shift of the way we regulate corporations was the 1933, 1934 Securities Acts, right? That basically say you have to, whenever you sell stock, you have to register it with the SEC. And there really hasn't been any, in my opinion, there has been nothing of that level of importance since 1934, which is a long time to go without major reform.
what misconceptions about corporations have you heard as you teach, or encountered when you speak to professionals, particularly misconceptions among business professionals who you'd think might know different? Are there, as you have you heard people have misconceptions about corporations?
Yeah, I mean, so the one that I think pops up, the one that's most central to my belief about the role of the corporation in the world today, is that, right, I think there is this strand of thought, right, that says corporation was created to seek after profit. Its sole obligation is to seek after profit. And I think that's wrong from a historical standpoint, right? When you go back and you look at these moments in history when society created them, that is, why did the Florentine government create the idea of the corporation? Why did Queen Elizabeth's England create the idea of the corporation, right? Over and over again, the reason why they did it was not to promote the interests of a few merchants. Right? Those merchants, they created their own corporation to get rich, but that's not why we as a society created them. Like, we as a society, and you see this over and over again, it's in the historical record, that we as a society created them, governments created them, to promote some idea of the common good. Right? It's not out of the question to say that the reason why we created the corporation was to promote the interests of the Commonwealth. And again, that those interests have shifted over time, right? When Queen Elizabeth's idea of what the common good was, it's quite different from what our idea of the common good is today, and it's certainly different from the idea of the common good in ancient Rome. And so those things I think are a matter of debate. But as a historical matter, I think it's quite wrong to say the reason why we as society, why the corporation was created in the first place was to pursue profit. That may be a means to an end, but it's a means, it's not the end.
Hmm. In addition to that argument, are there other arguments that your book is making that would be sort of in contention with, other books out there, other arguments out there? What what in your book would you say is, a bit of a debate where it's you're putting forward an argument?
Yeah, I think there's many other areas where I think I'm in contention with the sort of the well, at least contention with other scholars in the field, right? So I think that I disagree with some scholars about the role of fiduciary duties, about the kinds of things that a board of directors or a manager or an officer can think about. Right? I think that um, there's broad discretion granted to managers to be able to consider things beyond just the sole interest of profit of shareholders, and even right what the interest of the shareholder themselves is. I think those are also matters for debate. So I think I have a broader understanding of fiduciary duties than many people do, and that has been informed right by my research into um, both why we as a society created them, but also what has actually happened in history. What are the things that have led corporations to thrive? And I do think it is right this giving managers the leniency to promote what they think is in the best interest of the corporation. Um, I think that's another area where I stand slightly in contrast to other scholars.
Tell us about some of the research that you have going on right now. What are you working on next?
Yes, well, so my next book is it's a history of law. It's sort of in the same model as this current one, this current history of corporations, where I'm not writing an encyclopedic history of every law that's been passed, but instead it focuses on these foundational moments in time when sort of the way that we think about law, the way that we think about the rule of law, the role of the Constitution, the role of judges, the roles of democracy have changed. And so I again go back to the ancient Athens and the development of the court system, go back to ancient Rome and the development of the code, and then move all the way up through the U.S. Constitution, Magna Carta. The final chapter, at least currently, current draft is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So I'm starting to expand my horizons, but I hope it's a fun project.
All right, I'm ready to reorder that one, or pre-order that one as soon as it's ready. Um,
Thank
William,
you.
where can listeners find you online? Share any links that we should put in the show notes.
Yeah, so I have a Twitter. I have a Twitter page at Prof Magnuson, um, and then I'm on LinkedIn as well. Those are my two major places.
Amazing. We'll include those plus a link to the book in the show notes. William, this was a fabulous conversation. Really enjoyed getting this overview. I loved the book, and it was really great speaking with you about it.
Thanks so much, Will. This is a lot of fun today.